This isn't some fictional tale I cooked up, it's a true story from my life, a reminder that the deepest cuts often come from the hands you held as a child. The weight of the gold-plated pen felt heavier than any brick I'd ever laid, a solid, mocking ounce of my own success turned against me. Across the gleaming mahogany of the conference room table at Sterling and Finch, my company's law firm in Boston's financial district, my son Daniel and my daughter Claire watched me, their faces a perfect, practiced blend of sympathy and impatience. It was my daughter, Claire, who finally broke the silence, her voice smooth as polished marble as she pointed to the signature line on the document, "Just here, Dad. It's for your own good." If you genuinely enjoy our stories, please subscribe to the channel, tell us where you're from, and what time it is right now. It's always fascinating to know how far our story flows. My name is Arthur Blackwood, and for 45 years, I was the heart and soul of Blackwood Construction. I wasn't born into money, I was born into the dirt and grit of South Boston in the 1950s. My father was a dockworker, his hands permanently calloused and stained, and my mother stitched dresses in a cramped apartment that always smelled of boiled cabbage and hope. I built my empire with those same hands. I started with a single beat-up pickup truck, a handful of tools I'd bought on credit, and a stubborn refusal to fail. I laid foundations, framed houses, and hung drywall until my knuckles were raw and my back screamed in protest. I learned to read blueprints under a bare bulb at my kitchen table and taught myself how to bid on contracts by studying the ones I'd lost. Blackwood Construction grew. It grew from residential homes to commercial buildings, from small-time renovations to skyline-altering skyscrapers that now defined the modern Boston landscape. I was tough but fair. I remembered every employee's name, sent a gift when their kids were born, and showed up to the funerals when their parents passed. My wife, Eleanor, was my anchor through it all. She was the one who managed the books in the early days, who packed my lunch, and who told me I was a giant even when I felt like the smallest man in the world. She gave me 2 beautiful children, Daniel and Claire. They were my legacy. My reason for every sleepless night, every ounce of sweat, every risk I ever took. I gave them everything I never had: prep schools, Ivy League educations, cars on their 16th birthdays, and a future free from the fear of an empty pantry. Eleanor passed from cancer 12 years ago. The light of my world went out, and in the darkness that followed, I poured everything I had left into my children and my company. I groomed them to take over. Daniel, with his sharp, analytical mind, was perfect for the financial side, the deal-making and contract negotiations. Claire, charming and ambitious, had a flair for marketing and public relations. She could sell ice in a blizzard. I saw them as 2 halves of a perfect whole, destined to take the Blackwood name to even greater heights. I made them vice presidents, gave them seats on the board, and handed them responsibilities that most people their age could only dream of. I trusted them. Utterly. I saw their ambition not as greed, but as a reflection of the fire I passed down to them. The first trimmer came 6 months ago. I was on site at our new Seaport project, a massive glass and steel condominium complex. It was a windy day, and as I was shouting instructions to a foreman, a sudden wave of dizziness washed over me. The world tilted, my vision blurred, and the left side of my body felt like it had been unplugged. A transient ischemic attack, the doctors at Mass General called it. A mini-stroke. A warning shot. I was 65 years old. The doctor said I needed to slow down, reduce my stress. My kids latched onto that diagnosis like vultures to a carcass. "Dad, you need to rest," Daniel had said, his face a mask of concern. "Let us handle things. You've earned it." Claire echoed the sentiment, fluffing my pillows and bringing me organic juices I didn't want. It felt less like care and more like management. They started small. They'd cancel my meetings, telling my assistant I wasn't feeling well. They'd simplify my access to company accounts, creating a new, streamlined portal that I, coincidentally, couldn't seem to log into. They'd intercept calls from old friends and business partners, assuring them that I was enjoying a well-deserved retirement and that they were now the sole points of contact. I was being gently, lovingly, and systematically erased from the empire I had built. I tried to push back, But I was weak from the stroke, and honestly, a part of me didn't want to believe what was happening. These were my children. Eleanor's children. I told myself I was being paranoid, that they were just overprotective. That brought me to this conference room, to this pen, to this stack of papers. They had called an emergency family meeting with the company lawyers. The room was cold, impersonal, all glass and brushed steel, a world away from the sawdust and sweat where Blackwood Construction was born. "It's a power of attorney, Dad," Daniel explained, his tone patient, as if speaking to a child. "And a transfer of your controlling shares into a trust. It's to protect you. To protect the company. What if you have another stroke? A more serious one? All your assets would be frozen. The company would be paralyzed." "My mind is fine, Daniel," I said, my voice raspier than I intended. "Of course it is," Claire cooed, reaching across the table to pat my hand. Her touch was cold. "But the doctors said you need zero stress. Legal and financial matters are stressful. We're just taking that burden off your shoulders. It's all still yours, Dad. We're just managing it for you." The lawyer, a slick-haired man named Peterson whom I'd known for 20 years, refused to meet my eye. He just stared at a spot on the wall behind my head. He knew what this was. This wasn't protection. This was a coup. The documents were thick with legalese, but I saw the key phrases: irrevocable trust, full fiduciary control, medical incapacitation. They were using my health scare to strip me of everything. I looked at my son, his handsome face, the expensive suit I'd paid for, the confident set of his jaw that I had taught him. I looked at my daughter, her perfectly manicured nails, the subtle glint of the diamond earrings I'd given her for her 30th birthday. There was no love in their eyes. There was only the finality. They had planned this. They had waited for a moment of weakness, and they had struck. "Your mother," I started, my voice catching. "She would be so. Mom would want you to be safe and healthy," Daniel cut in, his voice hard, the fake sympathy gone. The trap was sprung, and he was done pretending. "This is what's best. For everyone." He pushed the pen a little closer. The gold barrel gleamed under the recessed lighting. I thought of the first dollar I ever earned, framed and hanging in my study. I thought of Eleanor, her proud smile at the ribbon cutting for our first major project. All of it, every memory, every sacrifice, funneled down to this single, humiliating moment. Sign it, and become a ghost in my own life. Refuse, and they would drag me through a humiliating court battle, painting me as a senile old fool. They had me cornered. They knew it. And they were enjoying it. The faintest smirk played on Daniel's lips as he watched my hand tremble, waiting for me to pick up the pen and sign away my soul. My hand shook, not from age or weakness, but from a rage so pure and so cold it felt like ice water flooding my veins. I looked down at the signature line, a black dotted abyss waiting to swallow me whole. My whole life, I'd been a fighter. I'd fought poverty, I'd fought bigger companies, I'd fought recessions and union disputes. And now, I was expected to just surrender. To them? I gripped the arms of the leather chair, the expensive hide creaking under the pressure. I could feel their collective impatience, a palpable force in the sterile air of the room. They thought they had already won. They saw a frail, tired old man, scared and confused. They had no idea who they were dealing with. They had forgotten who taught them how to fight. And as I stared into their cold, expectant eyes, I knew this wasn't the end. It was the beginning. My mind was already moving, gears that had been idle for too long beginning to grind, to turn, to formulate a plan. They wanted my company? They wanted my legacy? Fine. But they were about to learn a very old, very painful lesson. You don't bury a man until you're absolutely sure he's dead. I picked up the pen. The weight was still there, but it no longer felt like a burden. It felt like a weapon. I uncapped it with a deliberate, audible click that echoed in the silent room. Daniel's smirk widened. Claire let out a small, relieved sigh. The lawyer shuffled his papers, preparing to witness the execution. I lowered the nib to the paper, hovering just above the line. I could feel their eyes on me, hungry, victorious. Then, I looked up, meeting Daniel's gaze first, then Claire's. I let them see the fire rekindle in my eyes, the one they thought had been extinguished forever. Instead of signing my name, I drew a single, thick black line through the entire signature box, ruining the page. I then slowly, deliberately, placed the cap back on the pen, the click echoing with finality. I laid it perfectly parallel to the stack of papers, stood up, and looked down at my 2 children. "No," I said, my voice no longer raspy, but clear and hard as granite. "Not today. Not ever." I turned and walked out of that room without another word, the sound of my own footsteps the drumbeat to a war they had just declared, and one I fully intended to win. The confusion on their faces was the first small taste of a victory that I would spend every remaining breath I had making absolute. They had forgotten that I was the one who built the castle, which meant I knew where every secret passage was, and where every foundation was weakest. The walk from the law office back to my brownstone on Beacon Hill was the longest of my life. The crisp October air did nothing to cool the furnace burning in my chest. Every passing face, every horn honk, every gust of wind felt like a personal affront. My city. My beautiful, brutal, beloved Boston. I had etched my name into its very bones, and my own flesh and blood were trying to erase it. When I finally got inside, the house was silent. It was always silent now. Eleanor's laughter no longer echoed in the halls. The scent of her rose perfume was long gone, replaced by the sterile smell of lemon polish from the weekly cleaning service Claire had hired. A service, I now realized, that probably reported back to her. How long had I been a prisoner in my own home? When did the locks change from keeping intruders out to keeping me in? I poured myself a scotch, a Macallan 25, a bottle I'd been saving. For what? A celebration? A retirement? Well, this was a celebration of a kind. A declaration of war. I sat in my leather armchair in the study, the one facing the large bay window that overlooked the public garden. For years, I had watched the seasons change from this window. Now, all I could see was the reflection of a tired old man. But beneath the wrinkles and the gray hair, the fighter was still there. He'd just been sleeping. The betrayal wasn't just about the money or the company. It was about the narrative. They were trying to write the end of my story, casting me as the feeble old patriarch put out to pasture. They were stealing my ending. They were stealing my name. My first move was to assess my situation. They controlled the company. They had the board, who I'd handpicked but who were now loyal to the new power. They had the lawyers. And, I suspected, they were about to make a move on my personal finances. I went to my computer, my fingers feeling clumsy on the keyboard. I tried to log into my personal bank accounts at Bank of America. Access denied. Please contact your account manager for assistance. My account manager. A young man named Richard, whose father I had given a job to 30 years ago. I called his direct line. It went straight to a placid, corporate voicemail. I called the main branch and asked for him. "I'm sorry, sir," the receptionist said politely, "Mr. Blackwood's accounts are now being handled exclusively by Mr. Daniel Blackwood's office. All inquiries must be routed through his executive assistant." So that was it. They had locked me out. Not just from the company, but from my own life. I was a king with no kingdom, no army, and no treasury. For 2 days, I did nothing. I let them think I had retreated, broken, and defeated. I let their calls go to voicemail. Daniel left a message, his voice dripping with condescending pity. "Dad, we're worried about you. What you did at the lawyer's office was irrational. We just want what's best for you. Please, call me. We can sort this out." Claire's was worse. She was crying. Fake, theatrical sobs. "Daddy, why are you doing this to us? After everything we've done to help you, you're not thinking clearly." They were building their case, documenting my erratic behavior, laying the groundwork to have me declared incompetent. They were smarter than I'd given them credit for. or perhaps more ruthless. On the third day, I decided to stop mourning and start fighting. If I had no army, I would have to be an insurgent. If I had no treasury, I would have to find a new one. My mind drifted back, years and years, to the early days. The days of cutting corners not out of greed, but out of necessity. The days before digital accounting and wire transfers. The days of handshake deals and cash in envelopes. I had been scrupulously honest for decades, but I'd grown up in a world where you always kept something back. A little insurance. A rainy day fund that no one, not even the IRS, knew existed. I stood up and walked to the large oak bookshelf that lined my study. It was filled with first editions, books I'd collected over a lifetime. I ran my fingers along the spines of Moby Dick, The Great Gatsby, The Sun Also Rises. I stopped at a worn, leather-bound copy of The Count of Monte Cristo. It had been Eleanor's favorite. A story of betrayal and meticulously planned revenge. How fitting. Behind the book, concealed in a hollowed-out space in the wall, was a small, heavy safe. I hadn't opened it in 15 years. The combination was Eleanor's birthday. The tumblers clicked into place with a satisfying thud. Inside was not a mountain of cash, but something far more valuable. There were several pristine, non-registered bearer bonds from the 1980s, a relic of a different financial era, amounting to a little over $100,000. There were also 3 fake passports with my picture, each with a different name, a holdover from a paranoid phase during a hostile takeover attempt in the 90s. And at the very bottom, there was a small, black ledger. My black book. In it, written in my own neat cursive, was a list. Not of my company's official dealings, but of the unofficial ones. The handshake agreements, the favors owed, the quiet compromises made to get the job done in the cutthroat world of Boston construction. Names of building inspectors who looked the other way for a case of whiskey, city council members who fast-tracked permits after a generous donation to their re-election campaign, rival contractors who'd been buried by deals I'd made that skirted the edges of legality. I hadn't looked at it in decades. It was a relic of a past I'd left behind. But my children had dragged me back into the mud. And if I was going to fight, I was going to use the weapons I knew best. This little black book wasn't just a ledger. It was an arsenal. And my children had no idea it even existed. The game had changed. They had the army and the castle. But I had a map of all the tunnels underneath it. The first name on the list was a man named Mick the Magician O'Malley, a retired forger and private investigator from my Southie days who owed me a favor bigger than God. I picked up a burner phone I kept for emergencies. It was time to call in a few ghosts. Mick O'Malley lived in a cramped, second-floor apartment in Dorchester that smelled of stale beer and regret. The place hadn't seen a feather duster since the Kennedy administration. Mick himself looked like he'd been aging in dog years. He was thin and wiry, with a shock of white hair and pale blue eyes that still held a spark of old-world mischief. He'd earned his nickname, the Magician, for his uncanny ability to make documents, identities, and inconvenient people disappear. I'd helped his daughter get into a top-notch rehab facility 20 years ago, quietly paying the bill and never mentioning it again. It was a favor he swore he'd repay in blood if necessary. "Arthur Blackwood," he said, a slow smile spreading across his wrinkled face as he opened the door. "To what do I owe the honor? I thought you'd be sipping Mai Tais on some private island by now." "I need your help, Mick," I said, stepping inside. "And your discretion." I laid it all out for him. The stroke, the betrayal, the legal documents, the frozen accounts. I didn't pull any punches. I let him see the anger and the pain. When I was done, he was quiet for a long moment, staring into his glass of cheap whiskey. "Your own kids," he finally said, shaking his head. "There's a special place in hell for that kind." "So, what's the play, Arthur? You want me to make them disappear?" "No," I said, my voice firm. "Disappearing is too easy. I want to dismantle them. I want to take back my company, and I want to do it in a way that leaves them with absolutely nothing. I want them to feel exactly what I felt in that conference room, powerless, humiliated, and erased. Poetic, Mick grinned. I like it. But they've got you locked down. No money, no access. You're a ghost. Not entirely, I said, pulling out one of the bearer bonds. Mick's eyes widened. I need you to cash this for me. Quietly. I need operating capital. And I need information. I want to know everything Daniel and Claire have been doing for the last 6 months. I want their bank statements, their phone records, their emails. I want to know who they're talking to, where they're eating, who they're sleeping with. I want to know where every dollar they've stolen from me is going. That's a tall order, Arthur. It'll cost you a good chunk of this, he said, nodding at the bond. Just get it done, Mick. I also need you to set up a new identity for me. Nothing fancy. Just a name, a bank account, and a credit card that can't be traced back to Arthur Blackwood. I'll be operating from the shadows from now on. For the next few weeks, I played the part of the broken old man. I stayed in my house, ordering groceries for delivery. I let Daniel and Claire believe their plan had worked, that I had accepted my fate. They even hired a companion for me, a stern-looking woman named Doris who was clearly there to spy on me. I was meek and compliant with her, letting her think I spent my days napping and watching daytime television. But when she was gone for the night, my real work began. Mick was a true magician. Within a week, I had a new identity, Mr. Alastair Finch, a retired history professor. I had a new, untraceable laptop and a series of encrypted email accounts. And the information started pouring in. Mick's report landed in my secure inbox like a bombshell. My children weren't just managing the company, they were getting it. Daniel had been rerouting funds through a series of shell corporations registered in Delaware. He was using company money to invest in high-risk, speculative tech startups, bleeding millions from the capital reserves I had painstakingly built over decades. He was cooking the books with a finesse that was both impressive and stomach-churning. He hadn't just inherited my ambition, he'd inherited my cunning and twisted it into pure, unadulterated greed. Claire's betrayal was, in some ways, even more personal. She was systematically selling off the company's smaller assets, the ones she deemed insignificant. This included a portfolio of low-income housing units in Roxbury that we operated at a loss as a service to the community. It was one of Eleanor's passion projects. Claire had sold them to a ruthless developer from New York who was planning to evict the tenants and build luxury condos. But the most galling discovery was what she was doing with the money. She wasn't just living a lavish lifestyle, she was funding her husband's failing political campaign for a city council seat. My money. My legacy. Being used to prop up that spineless leech she married. They seemed so powerful, so untouchable. They had the legal framework, the financial control, and the public image of two devoted children caring for their ailing father. They hosted charity galas, their pictures splashed across the Boston Society pages. Claire gave an interview to the Boston Globe, talking about the difficult but necessary transition at Blackwood Construction and her father's graceful retirement. She painted a picture of me as a beloved relic, a man whose time had passed. They were building a fortress of lies around themselves, and I was on the outside, a ghost rattling at the gates. They controlled the narrative, and in the modern world, that was everything. The world saw them as the dynamic new leaders, and I was just a sad old man. Every article praising them, every picture of them smiling at a fundraiser, felt like another shovel of dirt on my grave. The lowest point came when they announced the sale of the Blackwood building, our flagship headquarters on Atlantic Avenue. I had designed the lobby myself, incorporating marble from the same quarry my grandfather had worked in Italy. It was more than a building, it was a monument to my family's journey from poverty to prosperity. And they were selling it. The press release, penned by Claire, was full of corporate jargon about liquidating assets and pivoting towards a more agile, modern infrastructure. It was a lie. Mick's intel showed the truth. They were in debt, deep in the hole from Daniel's bad investments and Claire's political ambitions. They were selling the crown jewels to cover their catastrophic mistakes. They were burning down the kingdom to keep themselves warm. That night, I sat in my study, the press release glowing on my laptop screen, and I felt a profound sense of despair. They had won. They had more money, more power, more time. How could one old man, working from a burner laptop in a lonely brownstone, possibly fight back against an enemy that controlled everything? The scotch tasted like ash in my mouth. For a fleeting moment, I considered just letting it all go. Letting them have the ruins. But then I looked over at the photo on my desk. It was of me and Eleanor, standing on the empty plot of land where the Blackwood building would one day stand. Her arm was around my waist, her head on my shoulder, and she was smiling that smile that could light up a starless night. She had believed in me when I was nothing but a kid with calloused hands and a crazy dream. And I knew, in that instant, that I couldn't let them destroy what we had built together. Despair turned to ice. Grief turned to resolve. They hadn't won. They had just made me angry. They thought I was a relic. Fine. It was time to show them what relics can do. This wasn't about money anymore. It was about honor. It was about Eleanor. And my revenge would not be swift. It would be meticulous. It would be architectural. I was going to deconstruct their lives, brick by painful brick, until nothing was left but the rotten foundation. The first step was to secure my flank. I couldn't trust anyone at the company, but I knew there were still good people there, people loyal to the old ways. Loyal to me. My first call was to Frank Rizzo. Frank had been my lead foreman for 30 years before retiring 2 years ago. He was a cantankerous old Italian with a memory like a steel trap and a loyalty forged in concrete and rebar. I met him at a Greasy Spoon diner in the North End, a place we used to go for coffee at dawn before heading to a job site. He looked at me, his eyes full of concern. "Artie, I heard you were sick." "Your kid said." "What my kids are saying and what's true are two different things, Frank," I cut in, sliding Mick's folder across the table. "I need you to look at this." Frank spent 10 minutes reading, his face growing darker with every page. He saw the shell corporations, the asset sales, the debt. When he was done, he closed the folder and pushed it back toward me. He looked me straight in the eye. "The little bastards," he said, his voice a low growl. "What do you need?" "I need an army, Frank. Or at least a few good soldiers. I need people on the inside. People who are still loyal to me, not to them. I need eyes and ears on every job site. I need to know every shortcut Daniel is taking, every safety regulation he's ignoring to save a buck. I know how he operates. He's cutting corners to fund his losses. I need proof." Frank nodded slowly. "There are still a few of us old-timers around. The kids call us the dinosaurs. They're pushing us out, one by one. But they haven't gotten rid of all of us yet. I'll make some calls." My next visit was to a woman named Beatrice Miller. Beatrice had been my executive assistant for 40 years, a woman of formidable efficiency and unwavering discretion. Claire had forcibly retired her 3 months ago, giving her a pathetic severance package and a patronizing farewell party. I found her tending roses in the garden of her small house in Jamaica Plain. She was furious when I told her the truth. "I knew it," she hissed, snipping the head off a rose with vicious precision. "I knew they were up to no good. The way they spoke to you, the way they isolated you. It was disgusting." "I need your help, B," I said. "You know the company's filing system better than anyone, the digital and the old paper archives. There have to be things they've missed, old contracts, partnership agreements, things that could give me leverage." Beatrice's eyes lit up. "Oh, yes," she said with a slow, wicked smile. "They digitized everything, but they were sloppy. They didn't know about the off-site storage unit in Charlestown. The one we called the graveyard. It's where we put all the sensitive files from before 2005. I still have a key." While Frank and Beatrice began their work, I turned my attention to Claire. Her weakness was her vanity and her desperate need for social acceptance. Her husband, Robert, was a bland, handsome fool running for city council on a platform of fiscal responsibility and community values. It was a joke. I knew for a fact he was a failed real estate agent with a gambling problem. My money was funding his entire campaign, laundered through Claire's marketing expenditures. I decided to give the Boston press something real to talk about. Using my Alastair Finch persona, I created a blog. A simple, anonymous website called Boston's Rot. I started small, writing articles about corporate greed and political corruption in the city, citing public records and news reports. I built a small but dedicated following of journalists and political watchdogs. Then, I began to leak the information Mick had gathered. My first target was the sale of the Roxbury housing units. I didn't mention Blackwood Construction. Instead, I wrote a heart-wrenching exposé on the New York developer, detailing his history of predatory practices and mass evictions. I included anonymous, tearful quotes from the current tenants, terrified of losing their homes. I sent the article to a young, hungry reporter at the Boston Herald I knew was looking to make a name for herself. The story ran on the front page the following Sunday. Public outcry was immediate. Protesters gathered outside the buildings. City council members, smelling blood in the water, started demanding an investigation into the sale. Claire, who had brokered the deal, was suddenly caught in a PR nightmare. Her phone started ringing off the hook, not with congratulations, but with accusations. Next, I went after her husband. Mick had uncovered proof of Robert's gambling debts and a few very indiscreet affairs. I didn't leak the affairs, that was too messy. The gambling, however, was a matter of public interest for a man campaigning on fiscal responsibility. I wrote another post on my blog, this one titled, "Can a man who can't manage his own wallet manage a city's?" I laid out the debts, the casino markers, the desperate loans, all sourced from public records and mixed digging. I didn't name Robert directly, I just referred to a certain city council candidate from a prominent Boston family. But I included enough detail that any journalist worth their salt could connect the dots in under an hour. The story was picked up by a major political blog, and within a day, Robert's campaign was imploding. His donors started pulling their funding. His campaign manager quit. Claire was left trying to hold together the shattered pieces of her husband's and her own social ambitions. She was distracted. She was bleeding money. And she was making mistakes. While Claire was fighting a public relations war, Daniel was facing a quieter, more insidious attack. Frank's network of dinosaurs came through. They started feeding me information about the Seaport project, the massive condo complex where I'd had my stroke. Daniel, desperate to make up for his financial losses, was rushing the job. He was using substandard materials, falsifying inspection reports, and violating half a dozen OSHA safety codes. I received photos of cracked support beams, faulty wiring, and non-compliant ventilation systems, all sent to my encrypted email. This was the leverage I needed. I didn't go to the press. That would damage the company's name, my name, too much. I decided on a more surgical approach. I bundled the evidence, the photos, the sworn affidavits from 3 different foremen, and a detailed analysis of the building code violations, and sent it anonymously to the one entity Daniel couldn't bribe or intimidate, the company's insurance underwriter. I also sent a copy to the Boston Department of Public Works. The fuse was lit. It wouldn't be a loud explosion. It would be a slow, unstoppable fire that would burn through their finances and their credibility, and they would never even know who lit the match. I was no longer the defeated old man. I was a ghost in their machine, pulling levers, cutting wires, and watching them dance. The first domino fell on a rainy Tuesday morning. An army of city inspectors and insurance adjusters descended on the Seaport project, clipboards in hand and grim expressions on their faces. All work was halted immediately. A big, red stop work order was slapped on the gate, a scarlet letter of failure for all of Boston to see. The financial penalties began to accrue instantly, thousands of dollars a day in fines and contractual delays. Daniel was trapped. He couldn't hide the violations, they were literally written into the structure of the building. He couldn't bribe this many people. He was facing a catastrophic loss, a black hole that threatened to swallow the entire company. I watched the news report on my laptop, a small, grim smile on my face. The reporter spoke of serious safety concerns and potential structural failures. Daniel, caught by the news crew leaving the site, looked pale and shaken. The arrogant smirk was gone, replaced by the panicked look of a man who was no longer in control. The second domino was Claire. The scandals surrounding her husband's campaign had turned toxic. Major party donors, spooked by the gambling debts and the housing project fiasco, had abandoned them. Robert officially withdrew from the race, a humiliated wreck. Claire had funneled millions of company dollars into that black hole of a campaign, and now she had nothing to show for it but public shame and a mountain of debt. She and Daniel started fighting. Mixed surveillance picked up a screaming match between them in the company parking garage. She blamed his cowboy investments for forcing her to make desperate deals. He blamed her narcissistic ambition for drawing so much negative press. They were turning on each other, their alliance of greed fracturing under the pressure. This was a crucial part of my plan. A united front was strong, but a house divided against itself cannot stand. I had sown the seeds of distrust, and now I was watching them grow. Meanwhile, Beatrice had struck gold in the Charlestown storage unit. Buried in a dusty box of files from the company's incorporation was the original partnership agreement I had signed with my first business partner, a man named Joseph Moretti, who had died years ago. I had bought out his half of the company, but Beatrice had found something we had all forgotten, the ironclad clause. It was a provision Joe and I had insisted on to protect ourselves from corporate raiders. It stated that in the event of gross negligence or fiduciary mismanagement by the board, a founding partner, that was me, had the right to call an emergency shareholder vote to dissolve the current board and reconstitute it. It was a nuclear option, a forgotten relic of corporate law from a bygone era. Daniel and Claire, in their haste to modernize the company's bylaws, had never bothered to look at the original founding documents. They didn't know it existed. And my power of attorney, the one I had refused to sign, would have nullified it. My one act of defiance in that conference room had saved my entire war effort. With this weapon in hand, my path was clear. But simply taking back the company wasn't enough. It was too clean, too simple. I didn't want them just fired, I wanted them ruined. I wanted them to be pariahs in the city they so desperately wanted to rule. The final phase of my plan began to take shape, and it was centered around the one thing they still had, the upcoming Blackwood Foundation annual gala. It was the premier charity event in Boston, a night where the city's elite gathered to write checks and pat themselves on the back. Claire had been planning it for months. It was meant to be her coronation, a celebration of the new era of Blackwood Construction. It would, instead, be her execution. I began to orchestrate the finale. Through my Alastair Finch persona, I contacted the young reporter from the Boston Herald again. I told her I had an explosive story about corruption at the highest levels of Boston society, but it had to break on the night of the gala for maximum impact. I promised her the scoop of a lifetime. Then, I used Mick to hire a team of forensic accountants, the best in the business. I gave them the data Daniel had been trying to hide, the proof of his shell corporations and illicit money transfers. I didn't want accusations, I wanted an airtight, prosecutable case for embezzlement and corporate fraud. Finally, I called Frank Rizzo one last time. "Frank," I said, "I need you to gather the dinosaurs. All of them. Anyone who was forced out, pushed aside, or just plain disgusted by what my kids have done. Tell them to put on their best suits. I'm sending them invitations to the Blackwood Gala." The night of the gala was a perfect, clear evening in early December. The event was being held at the Boston Public Library, its grand, historic halls transformed into a glittering palace of champagne and hypocrisy. I wasn't there, of course. I was a mile away, in a sterile hotel room Mick had rented for me, with a bank of monitors displaying feeds from the news, social media, and a few discreet cameras Mick's people had placed inside the venue. I was a ghost at my own feast. I watched Claire arrive, resplendent in a shimmering silver gown, her disgraced husband trailing behind her like a well-dressed shadow. She was a queen on her throne, greeting senators and CEOs, completely oblivious to the guillotine hanging over her head. Daniel was there too, looking stressed but trying to project an aura of calm confidence. He was schmoozing with bankers, likely trying to secure a loan to stop the bleeding from the seaport disaster. They were so arrogant, so certain of their place in the world. They had no idea of the world as they knew it was about to end. At precisely 8:30 p.m., as Claire took the stage to give her keynote address, my plan went into motion. The Herald reporter, strategically seated at a front table, received a push notification on her phone. Her newspaper had just published her story online. The headline was devastating: Blackwood heirs accused of massive fraud, embezzlement scheme. The article was a masterwork of investigative journalism, laying out Daniel's financial crimes in meticulous detail, supported by the forensic accountant's report. It detailed Claire's use of company funds for her husband's campaign and the illegal sale of the Roxbury properties. It was a complete and total evisceration. As Claire began her speech about a legacy of integrity, phones all over the room began to buzz and light up. A confused murmur rippled through the crowd. People were looking at their screens, then up at Claire, their expressions shifting from polite interest to shock and disgust. Claire faltered, seeing the change in the room. Her confident smile wavered. Daniel, standing at the side of the stage, pulled out his own phone. I watched on my monitor as the color drained from his face. He looked like he'd been shot. The murmuring grew louder, turning into a chorus of angry whispers. Someone shouted, "Thief!" Then came the second act. As chaos erupted in the hall, the main doors of the library swung open. And in walked Frank Rizzo, followed by Beatrice Miller, and behind them, 24 other men and women, the dinosaurs. They were the foremen, the accountants, the project managers, the secretaries, all the loyal employees my children had fired, disrespected, and cast aside. They weren't shouting. They were silent. They walked slowly, deliberately, into the center of the room, their presence a powerful, unspoken indictment. They stood there, a silent army of ghosts, their eyes fixed on Daniel and Claire. They were the living embodiment of the legacy my children had tried to bury. The gala attendees, the bankers, the politicians, began backing away from Daniel and Claire as if they were contagious. The party was over. But I had one final flourish. My lawyer, armed with the ironclad claws and proxies from a majority of the shareholders, many of whom were the employees now standing in the room, stepped forward and served Daniel a notice. It called for an emergency vote to remove him and Claire from the board and seize control of the company's assets pending a full investigation into their criminal activities. It was all perfectly legal. Perfectly brutal. I watched on my screen as Claire crumpled, her perfect facade shattering into a million pieces. Daniel just stood there, paralyzed, as the world he had stolen burned down around him. The reporters, no longer guests, swarmed them like sharks, cameras flashing, microphones shoved in their faces. It was done. I hadn't just taken back my company. I had taken back my name. I had taken back my story. I turned off the monitors, plunging the hotel room into darkness. The only light came from the city outside my window. My city. I had risen from the ashes they had left me in, and I had ended them. Not with a bang, but with a quiet, complete, and utter unmaking. In the weeks that followed, the full extent of the carnage became clear. Daniel and Claire were arrested. The charges were extensive: corporate fraud, embezzlement, wire fraud. Their faces, once splashed across the society pages, were now on the front of every newspaper, looking haggard and defeated in their mugshots. The legal battles would be long and brutal, but the outcome was certain. They would go to prison. They had lost everything: the company, their freedom, their reputation. They had become a Boston cautionary tale. I, on the other hand, had quietly reassumed control of Blackwood Construction. The emergency vote was a formality. With the dinosaurs back on the board and Frank Rizzo as my new COO, we began the slow, arduous process of rebuilding. We halted the sale of the headquarters. We canceled the deal for the Roxbury properties and invested company funds into renovating them, dedicating them as permanent, low-income housing in Eleanor's name. We fixed the problems at the Seaport project, doing it the right way, the Blackwood way, no matter the cost. I never saw my children again. Their lawyers reached out, requesting I help with their defense, that I post their bail. I instructed my attorney to send back a one-word reply, no. They had made their choices. They had dug their own graves. It was not my job to fill them in, but it certainly wasn't my job to pull them out. I was not a father to them anymore. I was a consequence. My life settled into a new routine. I was back at the helm, but differently. I was 65, and I felt it, but it was a good kind of tired. The satisfaction of a hard day's work. I promoted from within, rewarding the loyalty of those who had stood by me. I wasn't building an empire for a legacy anymore. I was simply doing good work because it was the right thing to do. The fire of vengeance had burned out, leaving behind a strange, quiet peace. I had won. The war was over. My days were filled with blueprints and board meetings, but my nights were silent. I would sit in my study, in the big leather chair, and look out at the Boston skyline. So many of those lights, those towers of glass and steel, were there because of me. I had built a world my own children had tried to take from me. I thought about them sometimes, in their prison cells, stripped of their tailored suits and their arrogant smiles. Did they feel remorse? Did they understand the depth of their betrayal? Or did they only regret getting caught? I suspected it was the latter. Some foundations are just rotten from the start. I had done what I had to do. I had protected my wife's memory and the honor of my name. I had reclaimed my life. But victory in a war against your own blood is a strange and lonely thing. There are no parades, no medals. There is only the silence that follows the storm, and the cold, hard knowledge of what was lost. I sold the company a year later to the employees, setting up a trust that ensured it would be run by the people who had built it with their own hands. I kept the brownstone on Beacon Hill, but I spent more and more time at a small cabin I bought on Cape Cod, watching the tide come in and out, the endless, patient rhythm of the ocean a soothing balm on old wounds. My revenge was complete, my victory absolute. But some nights, when the wind howls just right and the house feels particularly empty, I find myself standing in the silent, grand foyer. I look at the empty spaces on the walls where the portraits of my children used to hang, and I am reminded that to win a war like mine, you have to be willing to burn down a part of your own house. The end.